Okay, welcome back. This is part 2 of the week 6 lecture. So let's just pick up with the French structuralists. We won't spend too much time on these guys, but this was a particular school that kind of sprang up in France during the 50s and 60s. And again, they're using some of these older structuralist concepts passed down from Saussure and Levi Strauss, but they're using them for more specifically literary purposes. But they're also kind of influenced by the Russian formalists. Like the Russian formalists, they view literary texts as functioning a lot like words or sentences. They're functioning a lot like those signs that I explained back in part 1. And the overall genre, the overall literary genre that a text belongs to, or the overall language, again, can sort of be functioning as that overall structure. So again, they're using the basic terminology and the basic approach that was handed down to them, but they are doing some different things with it. So again, for them, a literary text, yeah, it has different parts. It can be broken down and analyzed, but they're still looking for that structure. So just a few key terms and concepts associated with these guys. So these are some pretty famous names. If you go on to do more literary study at advanced levels, you're going to see these guys again. Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault. These were pretty influential thinkers, not just in France, but also here in America. That's why we are learning a bit about them. So some of the terms that kind of matter for them, again, similar in some ways to what we just saw with the Russian formalists. So they talk about histor or history versus discourse. We've already talked a little bit about discourse. So history is basically like the historical narrative, like the master narrative, or sort of these classic traditional stories that the Russian formalists were kind of identifying. And every culture has these, right? And again, some of them transcend different cultures, but the familiar types of stories that we read and watch all the time. But also this ties into our notion of history as sort of a narrative that unfolds in chronological time, from beginning to end. Things get better, and there's always this sort of logic or reason behind it. But they're making a distinction between that kind of like historical narrative or these like traditional stories, and then individual discourses that are those larger sort of traditional narratives rearranged, reworked, redone, refashioned by authors for their own aesthetic or political purposes. So again, these discourses are going to be perhaps more interesting than the larger histories or like master narratives that we're supposed to believe in and accept as mostly true. The discourses are like repackaging those larger narratives. So this is kind of a more exact and specific use of the word discourse compared to how I was using it before, but it's not totally different. It's just we need to think of discourses as being different versions of the historical narratives or the traditional stories that are very popular or well known in a particular culture. And different authors are spreading different discourses all the time. And again, they're rearranged. These are the classic stories. It's like the same relationship between story and plot that we were looking at with the Russians. These are the sort of classic narratives, the classic historical narratives being reworked, redone, perhaps subverted, perhaps sort of modified in weird, interesting ways, either for artistic reasons or maybe for political or social reasons. But again, these are all structures that we can examine. We can see the way these discourses are built. And they're still structures operating within larger structures. Another fun term that they mention at this point in the chapter is discursive manipulation. And this sounds really complicated, but it's actually something that we should all be able to recognize. So this is just the idea that authors who are creating all of these different discourses, they're often manipulating the audience by withholding certain information from us, or simply by choosing when and how the audience learns certain information. So this makes a lot of sense if you just think about any book that you've ever read. Just think about really basic literary techniques like flashbacks or flash forwards. Those are kind of manipulative, right? Because the author is manipulating time, and the author is manipulating the way that time is presented. So that's going to have an impact on how the reader perceives the text. And the book gives other examples, right? The alternation of dramatic and expository passages. Okay, what does that mean? Well, exposition just means when the narrator of a story is basically giving the reader information, describing things, establishing the setting, maybe providing background info that's necessary for an understanding of the plot. That's exposition. That's different than dramatic action, where we're actually seeing characters do stuff, or we're hearing characters talk, or we're getting some kind of access to the inner workings of a character's thoughts or minds. So those are two different sort of levels of a particular novel or short story. So even just the author kind of shifting from exposition to dramatic action, that's a kind of manipulation. Even just the distribution of those two kind of narrative modes is going to affect what readers know. Some authors don't really provide a lot of exposition. So just think about that. If the author doesn't provide background information or really establish the setting for the reader, then the reader's kind of in the dark, and the reader's not going to necessarily understand certain things immediately, and that might be by design. We've probably all seen a movie or a show or read a book where the whole point was to keep the audience in the dark about certain key plot points until the end. There's supposed to be a big reveal, a big surprise ending, whatever. That's all manipulation. And it's fun. I mean, it's part of what, literature and movies and all these other forms of text is part of what they are. It's part of the fun of watching or reading them. But the point is, these are all different ways that the authors can sort of construct their discourse. This is how they're building their discourse, but a lot of it is based on withholding information from us, the audience, or misleading us, deceiving us in various ways. But these are just kind of typical aspects of narrative, shifting viewpoints. Again, the narrator giving us information or not giving us information. We don't really question a lot of this stuff. We just kind of take what we have and we make the best of it, but make the most of it. But these are all parts of the structure of a text. And these are all parts of how these different discourses are being built by authors. So these are just things that we can look for and analyze. So a lot of these French structuralists talked about message and code, but they're using these terms a lot like Saussure and some of those earlier figures would have used sign and lang, or parole and lang. So basically for this sort of new generation, these more sort of contemporary, like mid-20th century scholars and critics, they're thinking about the message of a text, focusing like the parole or the sign. It is delivering some kind of meaning. It's a complex linguistic unit, this literary text, just like a sign. It's comprised of several different components, but ultimately it delivers some kind of a meaning. But that meaning only lands, it only makes sense within the context of a larger code or language. So again, that larger structure is the shared language. And then the structure, one of the structures operating within that big structure is this particular literary text that is constructed in very specific ways using discursive manipulation and other things that we can break down, understand, and analyze. So that's kind of fun. And also remember that a lot of the French structuralists and later generations of structuralists as well largely rejected the whole idea of authorship. they didn't care very much about authors. And I've mentioned this before. For them, authorship was just sort of it's just the rearrangement of already existing structures. So I don't want to go too deep down the rabbit hole here, but the sort of larger point that many of them make about authors is that for any code or language, there's going to be pre-existing structures that are already there. And again, this is kind of like what the Russian formalists are saying. It's kind of a similar idea, this idea that within a language or a culture, there are familiar, common, traditional stories that we're familiar with, narratives, historical narratives that we all kind of know. We've internalized them. So a lot of and there are other structures too, but it's kind of that same idea that there are all these structures floating around that authors have access to. And all the author is really doing is grabbing these pre-existing structures, whether they be Russian folk tales or certain kinds of stories that are told in horror movies or certain types of literary techniques that are used to build novels or poems. There are all these structures that the authors can grab and then sort of, use them for their own ends, put their own original spin on them, but they're not creating the structures. I mean, they're not originally making the structures. The structures already existed within this language, within this code, and the authors are just taking them, maybe modifying them in some interesting ways, and then putting them back out into that literary marketplace. So for structuralists, the authors don't really matter. The structures matter. So we might think that's interesting, or we might think that's wrong-headed, but you need to know that was largely, that wasn't, a consensus, but a lot of the structuralists did feel that way. So again, they're looking for those codes, the conventions, the structures that make meaning possible. But they're not always necessarily taking us to interpretations or readings, at least not all by itself. That's a thing to remember about structuralism. It might not take you all the way to an interpretation all by itself. And even a lot of these guys would have acknowledged that. They would have said structuralism alone cannot really get you to that interpretation. What it does is it allows you to identify certain features or patterns or these relationships within structures. You can identify these things within texts, and you can perhaps establish similarities between one text and another, or between one genre or another. Or you can see this pattern that reoccurs in all of these different novels or all of these different poems or folktales. So it is useful, but there is a limit to what it can do. Because if you accept the basic notion that there is more to literature than just the structures of language, if there's a little bit more than just signs and concepts and the relationships between them, then you can kind of see why structuralism is just one tool to use when we're conducting literary analysis. It's not the tool. It's not the only tool. But look over on page 175 for just some examples of the types of codes that they're looking for. Just the kinds of things that they would maybe try to identify at work in literary texts, just to sort of see a practical application. Again, on 175, those are some codes identified by Roland Barthes, who is a French theorist who was very famous for speaking quite a bit about the death of the author and how much the author doesn't matter. But again, instead of thinking about authors, he's thinking about those codes that you see on 175. So this is kind of an interesting way to approach literature, but again, because so much of this approach or school, so much of structuralism really came from other disciplines, other fields, it is somewhat limited if we're trying to arrive at an original interpretation or reading, but it can certainly be a valuable tool that we can use along with other tools. So let's wrap up by just talking a little bit about post-structuralism, which is synonymous with deconstruction. So This is a particular critical approach or school that makes a lot of people mad, and not just students, but also people within academia. This makes certain scholars and critics mad. Some people think deconstruction is kind of nihilistic and just sort of anarchy. I wouldn't go that far, but it can be a bit frustrating. It's a bit slippery, but it's kind of fun, and I just want to spend a few moments on it. So, like all of these earlier sort of versions of structuralism that we've been talking about, the post-structuralists who come a little bit later, more like 70s, maybe 80s, when they come along, they're still using this basic sort of Saussurian structuralist approach, kind of viewing literary texts as like linguistic units, kind of like a sign, and then the language or the genre, the type of literature that they're operating within, that kind of operates like the lang. And okay, so they're kind of using the same terminology and they're using a somewhat similar approach, but they are really breaking away from the structuralists. They're really sort of looking at a different end game. So unlike the structuralists and the Russian formalists who were mostly focused on grammatical features, again, linguistic or grammatical features, and there's a lot you can do with that stuff, but they were, again, somewhat surface level in their analysis because they were very much focused on these sort of basic core grammatical or linguistic units of language and how they work. So if the focus was grammatical before, with deconstruction or post-structuralism, remember, they mean the same thing. Now we're focused more on rhetoric, not grammar. So let me explain what I mean by that. Rhetoric can mean different things, and it's taken on some new meanings in more recent times, but it often refers to speech or writing that is meant to be persuasive. So I talk about it a lot in English 102 when we're working on our research papers. We are working on different rhetorical strategies that can help us make good arguments. But also, rhetoric, just in a more general sense, can refer to just speaking or writing well, basically. Or, again, to be persuadable. To be persuasive, to persuade others. So if we're thinking more along those lines now, we're going to see a pretty big break. So we're not so much interested in the grammatical units. We're more interested in sort of the techniques or the ways that language is used to write or speak well or to make arguments in speech or writing. So that's one key way that the deconstructionists are different than the structuralists. But also, they're different in that they don't really think we can ever arrive at a clear understanding of the meaning of a literary text. They just kind of reject that whole notion. So instead of sort of searching for the order or the meaning behind the structure, post-structuralists or deconstructionists are really looking at the disorder. They are looking at text's tendency to refute their own meaning, to be somewhat contradictory, to be ambiguous. And again, this stuff isn't coming out of left field, because if you think about the formalists, if you think about some of these earlier schools that we've learned about, a lot of them were interested in some of these same things. Even the reader response people were like, hey, texts are ambiguous. They're open to a lot of different interpretations. So that's not totally unlike what these post-structuralists are saying, but the post-structuralists are perhaps taking it to another level. So they're saying, look, texts always change. Meaning always changes. Texts are unstable. See, structuralists would argue that, look, maybe we can't give you the best interpretation of this poem, but we can definitely make you understand how the structure of language is working in this poem, how the poem itself is a certain kind of linguistic structure. We can help you to understand the structure. And what you do with the structure is kind of up to you. We might not tell you what the poem means, but we'll tell you how it works. We'll tell you how the structure works. And structuralism has this sort of implied promise that if you follow our steps, we'll get you there. We will get you to an understanding of the structure. And the formalists, going back to them, they would say, hey, we're going to help you to understand the poem. There is one true meaning. New historicists wouldn't have said that, but they would say our examination of history is going to allow us to better interpret whatever this text is. So all the schools kind of have this belief that, hey, if we use the right techniques, we're going to arrive at some kind of meaning. Some kind of meaning. But at this point here, with the deconstructionists, we are rejecting that. Okay? They're saying, look, the only meanings that exist are kind of provisional or temporary. They're always subject to change. And they actually use Saussure's evidence from years earlier. And they say, look, if there's always just an arbitrary connection between signifier and the concept that it's signifying, then clearly language is not reliable. If all the relationships of language, if all the relationships between sound, images, and concepts are arbitrary and can just as easily change. I mean, I kind of forgot my train of thought earlier thinking about Google, but just to finish that, like the whole point they're making on this site is you could replace the word Google with a different word and it would work the same. Because there's nothing inherent about the word or the sound or the image of Google, the word itself. There's nothing there in the signifier that logically connects it to the concept of an online search engine. So if Yahoo had been more popular than Google, then we would use Yahoo the way we use Google. And we could have come up with a completely different word because, again, at a certain level, this is all arbitrary. It's just about sort of practice. And if people hear the word, see the word, and use the word long enough, it will become natural. But again, the post-structuralists are saying, but if this is all arbitrary, if we could just sub out the word Google for the word Bissum, and it functions the same way if people just learn it, then language is unstable. Language can be altered at sort of the drop of a hat. So there's nothing reliable, there's nothing constant, and whatever meaning we can locate, it's not stable or consistent. So everything is just kind of in flux. So they like to take what appears to be the meaning of a text and deconstruct it, take it apart, show that the meaning is actually contradicted or refuted by something else within that linguistic structure, within that particular text. So their point is, yes, these are structures, but you can never pull out a coherent meaning from these structures. So that irritates some people. Other people think it's fun. But one of the famous deconstructionists, Jacques Derrida, another French guy, he made this claim that I think is a good way to end our lecture. He says that the whole Western tradition, all of Western art, all of our historical narratives, all of the different discourse, it's all very restrictive because we limit language, because we want everything to have a clear, specific meaning. We want Google to mean a specific thing, okay? Everything has to have this structure, this order. And he says, as a result, because we're so fixated on that, we really deprive ourselves because language is sort of limitless and it has all of these different potential meanings and all of this playful stuff that you can do with it. And he says, but we confine it, we limit it. And that's somewhat repressive. We not only repress language, but we repress thought. So that's his whole big thing. But then he follows it up by saying, yeah, however, there's no escape. Because he's criticizing all of Western thought, all of Western writing, all of these linguistic structures. But he acknowledges that the only way he can criticize that stuff is by using language. So he has all of these problems with language, but he's a prisoner of language, just like the rest of us. He's a prisoner of that same Western tradition that he's trying to get outside of. So he concludes that there's really no way to get outside of language. There's no way to get outside of a literary text even. There's no way to sort of find yourself on more stable ground outside of the instability of language, because language is all we have. Language is the only way we can communicate with one another. So we're trapped in this sort of repressive system, but there are maybe potential ways that we could liberate language, according to him, because language has sort of unlimited possible meanings. So some people think that's kind of, again, kind of liberating and exciting. Other people think that they're just irritating. So very quickly, I do want to mention Bakhtin and his dialogics. I don't want to get into this much. They cover it pretty well at the end of the chapter. He's just kind of shoehorned in here. He's kind of similar to the Russian formalists. He's very influenced by structuralism. So again, he's another one of these theorists or critics who come along a little later after Saussure, and they take these ideas and these structuralist ideas and apply them to literature. But again, he's a Russian guy, so he's largely working with Russian novels, and he's mostly interested in novels. But Bakhtin kind of comes up with this idea that's very important even today for a lot of scholars and critics, this idea of dialogic novels versus monologic or monological novels. Again, sounds complicated. It's really not. He emphasizes language as sort of a scene of social conflict. So again, he kind of accepts the basic Saussurean model of structuralism, how it works, how literary texts kind of function like signs, like linguistic units. He's on board with all of that, but he thinks language is often expressing conflict and sort of oppositions between different kinds of people, and he thinks that novels do that best because novels are the most dialogic of all literature, which means they have multiple voices. We hear different characters. We hear different perspectives. And this, again, makes sense. If you've ever read a novel, you can kind of understand what he's saying, right? If you hear multiple characters talk over the course of the novel, and you also hear the voice of the narrator, which might be different than these other characters, you're getting multiple voices. And Bakhtin argues that the best novels are built that way or structured that way. They're dialogic because that's the way knowledge really gets created. You acquire knowledge by hearing multiple voices, receiving different viewpoints, different perspectives. He says, less artfully done novels tend to be monologic. They just have one voice, and that's the author's voice. So he says, if you read a book where it sounds like all the characters kind of sound the same, all the characters maybe sound like the narrator, and maybe the narrator sounds like the author, that's monologic. That's just one voice, the author's voice, or maybe the narrator's voice. And even though, we hear from other characters, they don't really have distinctive, unique voices. So we just end up with one perspective, one voice. And the descriptions of the other characters that we get, the dramatic action that we get, all of that is going to be given to us, related to us through that one voice. So that limits the amount of knowledge and experience that we can really acquire. So Bakhtin argues that novels have kind of always been around, but they didn't really take off until after the Renaissance. He claims that kind of the origins of novels can be found in all of these earlier forms of literature and texts, but he just kind of privileges novels, and he thinks novels can also exist in other literary forms. So he's kind of a weird guy. The main thing I remember, this has nothing to do with anything academic, but the thing I remember about Bakhtin when I learned about him in grad school, so he was alive during the Russian Revolution, which is a time of great upheaval in Russia, right? And he was in dire poverty for a while. So we lost a lot of his original writings because, legend has it, he rolled up a lot of his original writings as rolling paper for his cigarettes because he ran out of his normal equipment for rolling his own cigarettes, so he had to use his own writing. At least that's the legend. He had to use his own writing in order to smoke in his poverty-stricken circumstances. But that's not very important. That's just the way I remember him. One last concept, though, that he introduces that I think is kind of important for us. It's this idea that, again, it's not just that he likes dialogic novels. He thinks this sort of dialogic way of being is best, not just in literature, but like in life. So he uses the example of being addressed, and they mention this in the book. I'm not sure if it's explained super clearly, but he says you can never understand another person simply by studying that person scientifically. You can observe the person. You can take scrupulous notes about what the person looks like, their clothes. You can observe their behavior, what they do, but you're not really going to know that person unless you talk to that person. So just think about dialogue. Just think about people talking as a way of acquiring knowledge. And Bakhtin says that, if you want to know a person, you have to address that person. Hey, excuse me. And then the person turns and says, yes. And now it's a dialogue. Now it's multiple voices. Now it's two people talking. And you might not talk very long. You might not learn very much, but that's the way you learn about one another, is by engaging in that dialogue. And that necessarily means more than one voice. So that's good in lit. And that's good in regular life if we want to get to know people. But again, it's a structure. We can understand novels by understanding their dialogic structure. And there's a way to track that, think about that, and analyze it. All right, so that's all we can really do this week. I'll sign off. Next week, we're going to tackle Chapter 6, Literature and Psychology. Okay, so again, just 1 week to cover it. It's not a terribly difficult chapter to get through. So this is kind of intended to be a little bit of a lighter week since we just turned in our first critical response paper. This chapter's not super long, but let me know if you have any questions. Chapter 5, that is. Chapter 6 is similar. Not too difficult to get through in terms of length, but a lot of concepts, a lot of complexity. So let me know if you have any questions, and if you don't, I will just see you next week.